The moment Allied troops reached Aachen in the autumn of 1944, the war changed its character forever, because this was no longer occupied territory. No borderland, no liberated city, but Germany itself, the symbolic heart of the Reich, the city of Charlemagne, a place whose fall would signal to the world that Hitler's empire was cracking from within. And that is exactly why Hitler ordered Aachen to be held at all costs, forbidding retreat, surrender, or negotiation, even as the city was already surrounded. Many American soldiers believed the German army was close to collapse, weakened by constant bombing and retreating on every front. But Aachen shattered that illusion brutally and without mercy. The city was transformed into a fortress where every cellar became a bunker, every church a strongpoint, and every street a killing zone designed to slow the enemy at any price. German defenders no longer fought for victory, but for delay, for symbolism, and for obedience to an order that left them no future. When the US 1st Infantry Division and later the 30th Infantry Division entered the outskirts of Aachen, they encountered something new, urban warfare on a scale they had never experienced before. Tanks struggled to maneuver through rubble-choked streets, infantry advanced building by building under constant sniper fire, and artillery flattened entire neighborhoods, only to reveal defenders still fighting from the ruins. The Germans lacked air superiority, fuel, and reinforcements, yet they possessed something far more dangerous: absolute desperation. Many defenders were Volkssturm, Hitler Youth, and exhausted regulars, who knew the war was lost but believed surrender was betrayal. Every hour of resistance bought time for the Reich, and every ruined house became a weapon. American units quickly realized that Aachen would not fall through speed or firepower alone. Progress was measured in meters, casualties mounted rapidly, and morale was tested by the constant uncertainty of fighting an enemy who could emerge from basements, tunnels, and collapsed walls without warning. Aachen became a grim lesson in what the invasion of Germany would truly cost. Not a swift march to Berlin, but a grinding war of attrition fought among civilians, history, and rubble. By the time the battle truly began, it was already clear that Aachen would not just be captured, it would be destroyed. And in that destruction, the Allies saw a preview of the brutal end that awaited the Third Reich. Battle of Aachen was not just another Allied advance on the map of World War II. It was a psychological breaking point for both sides, because for the first time a major German city itself became a battlefield, and the myth of the inviolable Reich was forced to bleed in the open. Aachen was not chosen by accident. It lay directly on the western edge of Germany, guarded by the remnants of the Siegfried Line, surrounded by bunkers, dragon's teeth, concrete gun emplacements, and streets prepared in advance for house-to-house combat. For Hitler, losing Aachen was unthinkable, because symbolically it was the city of Charlemagne, a historic heart of German identity, and militarily it was a gateway deeper into the Ruhr industrial region. For the American soldiers of the 1st US Army, Aachen was their first step into Germany itself, and many of them crossed that border with a mixture of determination and dread, fully aware that the fighting ahead would be different from France or Belgium. The battle began in October 1944 and immediately revealed how brutal urban warfare could become. German defenders, including regular Wehrmacht units, SS formations, Volksgrenadiers, and even hastily assembled civilian militias, were ordered to fight to the last man. Retreat was forbidden. Surrender was framed as treason. The city was slowly encircled, cut off from reinforcement, and systematically reduced by artillery and air power. Yet even under relentless bombardment, the defenders refused to collapse. American infantry advancing through narrow streets faced sniper, fire from shattered buildings, machine guns hidden in basements, and Panzerfaust ambushes at point-blank range. Every intersection became a kill zone. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in rooms and staircases. Tanks struggled to maneuver, engineers were forced to clear obstacles under fire, and casualties mounted rapidly on both sides. Civilians who had not managed to flee were trapped in cellars, surviving on dwindling supplies as the city around them was pulverized. The Germans hoped that by turning Aachen into a fortress they could delay the Allied advance long enough for a strategic reversal elsewhere. But the reality was harsher. Without supplies, without air support, and with morale steadily eroding, resistance became increasingly desperate rather than effective. After weeks of fighting, with much of the city reduced to ruins, the last German defenders finally surrendered on October 24, 1944. Aachen fell, not in a dramatic collapse, but in exhaustion and inevitability. Its capture sent a shockwave through Germany. For the first time, Allied flags flew over a German city. proving that the Reich was no longer untouchable. For the Allies, Aachen was both a victory and a warning. It demonstrated that penetrating Germany would not be fast, clean, or cheap. Every city could become another Aachen. Every street could demand blood. By mid-October 1944, the Battle for Aachen had stopped being a clean military operation and turned into a brutal fight of attrition, fought street by street, building by building, room by room. American infantry entering the outer districts quickly learned that this was nothing like fighting in open fields or hedgerows. The city had been turned into a fortress. German defenders, many of them exhausted Volksgrenadiers reinforced by remnants of elite units, used every cellar, stairwell, sewer entrance, and pile of rubble as a firing position. Rubble itself became a weapon. Destroyed buildings blocked streets, forcing tanks to funnel into narrow corridors where Panzerfaust teams waited at point-blank range. A single German soldier hiding behind a collapsed wall could halt an entire American advance for hours. The soundscape of Aachen was constant and suffocating. Artillery detonations echoing between stone buildings, the crack of rifles, the dull thump of grenades thrown blindly through doorways, and the screams of wounded men trapped under debris. American units relied heavily on coordinated assaults combining infantry, engineers, flamethrower teams, and tanks, but even these tactics were slow and costly. Engineers had to blow holes through walls just to avoid exposed streets, while flamethrowers were used to clear basements that defenders refused to abandon. German resistance was not organized in neat defensive lines, but in isolated pockets that refused to collapse. A single apartment block could change hands multiple times in one day. Civilians still hiding in cellars found themselves caught between both sides, terrified, dehydrated, and starving, while shells shattered the remaining infrastructure of the city. American soldiers were shocked by the psychological strain. Fighting inside Aachen meant never knowing where the enemy was. Snipers fired from church towers, machine guns erupted from second-floor windows, and booby traps were hidden in door frames and staircases. Progress was measured in meters, not streets. Commanders quickly realized that speed was impossible. Every attempt to rush forward resulted in heavy casualties. The battle became a grinding test of endurance, discipline, and morale. For the Germans, holding Aachen was no longer about victory, but about delay. Every day gained meant more time for the Reich to prepare defenses deeper inside Germany. For the Americans, taking Aachen was about proof. Proof that the German border could be broken, proof that even a symbolic city could fall, and proof that the war was now being fought on German soil with a level of brutality that matched anything seen earlier in Europe. By mid-October 1944, the battle for Aachen had entered its most brutal phase, where ideology, exhaustion, and urban warfare collided head-on. American troops now controlled most of the surrounding high ground, effectively sealing the city and cutting off meaningful reinforcement or resupply. Inside Aachen, German resistance became increasingly fragmented. Command structures broke down as officers were killed or isolated, leaving small groups of defenders to fight on their own initiative. Many German soldiers no longer knew the broader situation. They only knew that retreat was forbidden, and surrender was portrayed as betrayal. This psychological trap proved as deadly as American firepower. Meanwhile, US commanders faced mounting pressure to end the battle quickly. Aachen was consuming men, ammunition, and time, all while the broader Allied advance into Germany depended on momentum. Artillery barrages intensified, not only to destroy fortified positions but to shatter the will of defenders. Entrenched in cellars and ruins, tanks moved cautiously, often operating at point-blank range, firing directly into building facades to neutralize resistance before infantry advanced. Every street became a puzzle of rubble, booby traps, and hidden firing points. Snipers turned windows and church towers into lethal vantage points, forcing American units to adopt a slow, methodical clearing process that prioritized survival over speed. Civilians who remained trapped in the city endured conditions that defy simple description. Water and electricity were gone, food was scarce, and shelter was often no more than a collapsed basement. Some civilians attempted to signal surrender or flee, only to be caught in crossfire or accused of treason by German defenders. The moral weight of the battle grew heavier by the day. For the Americans, Aachen was no longer just a military objective. It was a preview of what awaited them deeper inside Germany. For the Germans, it became a grim demonstration of how ideology could demand destruction without offering salvation. As resistance shrank to isolated pockets, American psychological warfare units broadcast surrender appeals, promising humane treatment and survival. Slowly, reluctantly, some defenders began to give up. Others fought to the end, not because they believed victory was possible, but because they believed they had no alternative. The battle was no longer about strategy, it was about collapse, one ruined block at a time. As the fighting dragged on, Aachen ceased to function as a city and became a system of interconnected kill zones, where every pile of rubble served a tactical purpose. American infantry learned quickly that traditional maneuver warfare no longer applied. Progress was measured in meters, not blocks. Assault teams adapted by using explosives to breach walls rather than risk exposed streets, moving through buildings internally like miners carving tunnels through stone. Flamethrowers were employed against fortified basements and bunkers, not as weapons of terror but as grim necessities when conventional fire failed to dislodge defenders. German resistance, though shrinking, remained dangerous precisely because it was decentralized. Small groups operated independently, ambushing advancing units and disappearing into ruins that offered near-perfect concealment. The absence of clear front lines meant that danger could emerge from any direction at any moment. This constant uncertainty drained morale on both sides. American soldiers described Aachen as mentally exhausting, a place where sleep was shallow and nerves were permanently raw. For German defenders, isolation intensified the sense of abandonment. Radio contact was sporadic, supplies were nearly gone, and promises of relief from higher command rang hollow. Yet propaganda and fear of retribution continued to hold some units in place. The psychological dimension of the battle became increasingly decisive. Loudspeakers urged surrender, leaflets promised survival, and prisoners of war were sometimes paraded within sight of defenders to demonstrate humane treatment. These efforts slowly eroded resistance, especially among older Volkssturm members and wounded soldiers who saw no reason to die for ruins. Still, pockets of fanatical resistance persisted, particularly among SS elements and committed Nazi officials who believed surrender meant execution. Meanwhile, American commanders wrestled with the cost of victory. Casualties mounted steadily, not in dramatic spikes, but in a relentless daily toll that wore down units. Replacement troops arrived inexperienced and were immediately thrown into the chaos, learning urban combat under fire. Aachen thus became a brutal classroom, shaping tactics that would later be used in Cologne and beyond. The city was teaching both sides a harsh lesson. This was not a campaign of swift breakthroughs, but a war of attrition fought in shattered streets, where ideology and reality collided, and neither emerged unscathed. By mid-October, the battle entered its final and most suffocating phase, where survival depended less on strategy and more on endurance. Aachen was no longer defended as a coherent position, but as a collection of isolated strongpoints, each fighting its own private war. German units were cut off from one another, often unaware of what was happening just a few buildings away. Ammunition was rationed to the last magazines, food was nearly gone, and water had to be scavenged from broken pipes under fire. Wounded soldiers were treated in cellars with no anesthesia, no light, and no hope of evacuation. Yet despite this collapse of logistics, resistance did not immediately end. What sustained it was a mixture of fear, indoctrination, and the simple human refusal to admit defeat. American forces, sensing that the city was close to breaking, increased pressure systematically. Artillery strikes were coordinated block by block, collapsing remaining defensive positions before infantry advanced. Tanks were brought forward despite the risk, firing point blank into buildings to neutralize hidden weapons. Engineers followed closely behind, clearing rubble and booby, traps that slowed movement and inflicted casualties long after a position was taken. The sounds of battle echoed endlessly, gunfire reverberating through ruins, explosions bouncing off shattered stone, creating an atmosphere where time itself seemed distorted. Days blurred together. For civilians still trapped in the city, existence became a matter of hiding and waiting. Many had been forced into basements weeks earlier, surviving on scraps, unsure whether the next sound would be an American shell or a German counterattack. Their presence further complicated the battle, as soldiers on both sides encountered non-combatants emerging from ruins like ghosts, desperate and terrified. As American units pushed deeper, surrender became more common. Groups of German soldiers emerged cautiously, hands raised, often shocked to find they were treated as human beings rather than enemies. This reality directly contradicted years of propaganda and accelerated the psychological collapse of remaining defenders. The battle was no longer about holding Aachen. It was about delaying the inevitable and surviving it. Command structures disintegrated, orders ceased to arrive, and the idea of coordinated defense vanished entirely. What remained was a city being slowly, methodically consumed by a superior force that could afford time, resources and casualties, while the defenders had nothing left to spend except their lives. By mid-October 1944, the Battle for Aachen had entered its most brutal phase, where ideology, exhaustion, and urban warfare collided head-on. American troops now controlled most of the surrounding high ground, effectively sealing the city and cutting off meaningful reinforcement or resupply. Inside Aachen, German resistance became increasingly fragmented. Command structures broke down as officers were killed or isolated, leaving small groups of defenders to fight on their own initiative. Many German soldiers no longer knew the broader situation. They only knew that retreat was forbidden, and surrender was portrayed as betrayal. This psychological trap proved as deadly as American firepower. Meanwhile, US commanders faced mounting pressure to end the battle quickly. Aachen was consuming men, ammunition, and time, all while the broader Allied advance into Germany depended on momentum. Artillery barrages intensified, not only to destroy fortified positions but to shatter the will of defenders. Entrenched in cellars and ruins, tanks moved cautiously, often operating at point-blank range, firing directly into building facades to neutralize resistance before infantry advanced. Every street became a puzzle of rubble, booby traps, and hidden firing points. Snipers turned windows and church towers into lethal vantage points, forcing American units to adopt a slow, methodical clearing process that prioritized survival over speed. Civilians who remained trapped in the city endured conditions that defy simple description. Water and electricity were gone, food was scarce, and shelter was often no more than a collapsed basement. Some civilians attempted to signal surrender or flee, only to be caught in crossfire or accused of treason by German defenders. The moral weight of the battle grew heavier by the day. For the Americans, Aachen was no longer just a military objective. It was a preview of what awaited them deeper inside Germany. For the Germans, it became a grim demonstration of how ideology could demand destruction without offering salvation. As resistance shrank to isolated pockets, American psychological warfare units broadcast surrender appeals, promising humane treatment and survival. Slowly, reluctantly, some defenders began to give up. Others fought to the end, not because they believed victory was possible, but because they believed they had no alternative. The battle was no longer about strategy, it was about collapse, one ruined block at a time. As resistance inside Aachen continued to crumble, the broader meaning of the battle began to take shape, even if the soldiers fighting in the rubble could not yet see it. For the American army, Aachen was no longer just another objective on the map. It had become a proving ground for a new kind of warfare that would define the final push into Germany. Urban combat on this scale was something the US forces had largely avoided until now, preferring maneuver warfare and encirclement. In Aachen, there was no bypass. The city had to be taken, street by street, room by room, at enormous physical and psychological cost. Commanders closely observed how infantry, engineers, and artillery interacted under these conditions, learning painful but vital lessons that would later be applied in Cologne, Ruhr, and eventually Berlin itself. To the German side, Aachen exposed the fatal weakness of Hitler's defensive doctrine. The insistence on holding every position to the last man did not create heroic stands that changed the course of the war. It created pockets of isolated destruction that consumed experienced soldiers without achieving strategy. Units that could have withdrawn and reformed were instead annihilated or captured, accelerating Germany's overall collapse. Inside the city, remaining defenders faced an impossible dilemma. Surrender meant survival, but also the destruction of everything they had been taught to believe in. Continuing to fight meant almost certain death in the fields that was already lost. Many chose survival, not out of cowardice, but clarity. American psychological warfare, loudspeakers, leaflets, and humane treatment of prisoners spread rapidly through the rooms, undermining the last pillars of resistance more effectively than shells alone. Meanwhile, American troops grew increasingly exhausted. Victory was no longer exhilarating, it was mechanical. Clearing one building simply meant advancing to the next. Losses mounted quietly, names added to casualty lists without dramatic breakthroughs to justify them. The city itself was barely recognized. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to skeletal remains, landmarks erased, history pulverized and built. Aachen, once a symbol of European heritage and Imperial legacy, and a warning of what modern war did to civilization when ideology entered easy. By this stage, German command outside the city had effectively written Aachen off. Attempts to relieve the garrison failed, not because of lack of courage, but because the material was overwhelming. American artillery dominated every approach, and air power ensured that any movement during daylight was punished instantly. The defenders inside were alone. They knew it. The final days were marked not by dramatic counterattacks, but by silence broken intermittently by surrender or sudden, localized violence as holdouts fought to the end. The Battle of Aachen closed a chapter and opened a far darker one in the history of the Second World War, because it proved that the war had irreversibly crossed into the German heartland and that no city, regardless of symbolism or fortifications, could escape the logic of total war. What happened in Aachen was not an anomaly but a blueprint. It showed how modern armies, armed with artillery, armor, air power, and ideological resolve, would grind cities into rubble street by street, house by house, cellar by cellar. For the United States Army, Aachen confirmed operational superiority, but also delivered a brutal lesson in cost, fatigue, and psychological strain. For Germany, it marked the beginning of the end of territorial integrity and the collapse of the myth that sacrifice alone could stop the advance. Civilians paid the highest price, trapped between strategic necessity and political fanaticism, reduced to survival in ruins that once defined their identity. When the guns finally fell silent, Aachen did not feel like a victory or a defeat. It felt like a warning. The city became a mirror of what the future held for Cologne, for Berlin, for countless other urban centers that would soon face the same fate. In that sense, Aachen was not just the first German city to fall. It was the moment the war revealed its final form, relentless, uncompromising, and indifferent to history, symbolism, or human suffering. From the rubble of Aachen, the outcome of the war was no longer a matter of speculation, only a matter of time.